I can't believe that a few weeks have passed already. I'm sorry it took so long to get this update posted. Everything that happened has been a lot to process. At first, I didn't want to even write it down. I didn't want to relive that night, but I guess I can't avoid it forever. Almost exactly 2 years to the day from my first post, my best friend Liz disappeared from room 347 in the middle of the final night of our stay. I woke up alone the next morning to the door still bolted from the inside. She had left everything behind. The only place she could have gone was through the dark, narrow space behind the small door and false wall leading from our room. Even after crawling through it myself, I never found her. The hotel manager and the police were not just insistent that she left of her own volition, but were almost threatening when I pushed further. Her fiancé, Jared, and I had been searching for her ever since. When I finally got the chance to stay in that same room again, hoping for even a slim chance of finding out what happened to her, I took it. So I bought a little can of triple-action pepper spray, packed a bag, and scheduled an email to go out to Jared the morning after the final night of my stay. You know, just in case I never came back. I've been home for a few weeks, and even now, I'm still struggling and trying to put some of the pieces together. I'm starting to accept that there are some things I may never fully understand. During my recent stay, I didn't spend much time in the room, with its overpowering smell of bleach mingled with something else that I couldn't quite place. Mostly, I tried to search the surrounding city for anything I may have missed before, and of course explored every part of that hotel that I could. Details I didn't catch during our first stay, or pay enough attention to before my final night a few weeks ago, are now haunting me. Details such as how a ritzy-looking hotel in the middle of a popular tourist destination never seemed to have anyone else in it. Or how there was no way to get to the 7th floor. The buttons so casually skipped from 6 to 8 on the lone elevator, and from the main stairs what should have been the entrance was just a solid wall. As I traversed the winding hallways, I realized that on every floor that I could access, other than my own, the new carpet and cheery paint stopped abruptly after a certain point. As I ventured deeper into the hotel, I found myself surrounded by the original fading wallpaper, stains marring the swirling patterns of the torn carpets. Even the light fixtures along the walls looked dated. Most struggled to stay on at all, often throwing the windowless halls into near darkness without warning. Whenever I crossed over to the old, unrenovated side, I always had a strange sense of discomfort, the kind you get when there's no one else around you, but you can tell that you are most certainly not alone. Traveling down those halls felt like stepping back in time, but to a time that was clearly better left forgotten. Initially, I thought maybe that was their way of saving money, neglecting the portions that most guests wouldn't venture to. One night, I was wandering around one of those eerily quiet floors, further in than I had ever gone before, and was drawn to a bit of brick peeking out from under cracked plaster and peeling wallpaper in the distance. It was almost entirely bathed in shadows, just beyond where the struggling hall lights had finally given up, and seemed older than everything else around it. There was a thin gap in the mortar, and while it was so dark that I couldn't see anything, I could feel a faint, stale breeze that carried with it an overpowering smell of rotting meat. Gagging, I turned around abruptly to see the hotel manager just a couple of feet behind me, his eyes glinting at me, unnatural looking in the low light. I pushed past him without incident, but I couldn't help but wonder if there had been other times he'd silently followed me down the dimly lit hallways without me noticing. After that, I made more of an effort to avoid him and his predatory smile. Every floor I could access had a similar makeshift wall in the same place. I eventually realized it was once a second elevator shaft, since bricked in and plastered over. Once, in the near silence, I thought I heard the sound of something moving behind it. It's probably easier to seal it off than to fix it, I'd told myself at the time. I preferred that explanation, rather than to acknowledge my distinct feeling that there was something, not someone, something, back there that I had no desire to meet. Eventually, I reached the final night of my stay, no closer to finding out what happened to her. The only thing left I could think to do was to try and recreate what I believed may have happened to her that night. As I prepared for bed, I shoved my phone in my pajama pocket and grabbed my little can of pepper spray. My grand plan at that point was to pretend to be asleep and see if anyone came for me that night. If they did, I'd hit them with the pepper spray and try and get a photo of them. It may not have been the best idea, but I knew it would be the last chance I'd ever get to find out what happened to her. After glancing nervously at my small can of pepper spray, I grabbed the Swiss Army knife off my keychain and shoved it in the other pocket for good measure. I began to wonder, as I stared up at the dark ceiling that night, in the exact room she'd disappeared from 2 years earlier, if they invited me there specifically for nothing to happen. I'd been telling anyone that would listen for years all about Liz's disappearance, about the narrow, dark space in our room I'd crawled through. Jared had been doing the same. Like I had said in my last post, he'd been trying to book that same room for years with no luck. What better way to further discount our concerns than for me to have a perfectly normal stay? Of course nothing would happen, I realized, disappointed, although with the tiniest bit of guilt-tinged relief mixed in. My thoughts were interrupted by the sound of furniture moving across the carpet. All the confidence and determination I'd felt in the daylight was gone in an instant. Never was I more aware that I was just one person alone in that awful place, armed with a phone, less than an ounce of pepper spray, and a tiny keychain knife, as in that moment where I wondered if someone would try and pull me out of bed and drag me into the dark. Maybe it would be easy enough to make me disappear inconspicuously after all. They had my credit card information. What was stopping them from using it a few towns over and then throwing all my luggage in some ditch? As I heard the old hinges of the small door protest, a flurry of jumbled thoughts went through my head as I clutched my little canister to my chest. I had always assumed Liz to be alive, and that someone took her out of the room and into the tunnel. But what if she hadn't been? What if they killed her, and they did it right here? There had been blood in the small crawl space. Enough had soaked into the carpet that it was still wet by the time I went looking for her. I was in the room with her physically that night, but I'm such a heavy sleeper that she may as well have been alone. Another sharp pang of guilt crept in to mingle with the terror. After a moment, I heard what sounded like raspy, strained breaths, the sound filling the otherwise silent room. It grew louder as whoever, whatever it was, emerged and began to head towards me. And then, only a few feet away, they stopped. I was so worried that if they knew I was awake, they'd leave before I could find out what happened. I tried to keep my eyes squeezed shut and hoped they'd get just a bit closer to make sure they'd be in range of the spray, since I'd probably only have one chance at this. The waiting in those long moments, though, as I wondered who or what was in the room with me, I finally couldn't take it. My eyes shot open. I don't know what I thought I'd see looming over me in the darkness. A stranger? A monster? But I know who I did not expect to see. Liz. She was barefoot, illuminated in the faint moonlight shining through the open sliver between the curtains. It was dark, her face mostly obscured in the shadows and contorted slightly as if with a strange little smile, but I could tell it was her. I could feel it. I gasped, and she seemed almost as startled as I was, because she took off running. I had barely stumbled out of bed by the time she'd already ducked through the door, past the false wall, and was crawling through the dark passageway faster than seemed humanly possible. I hissed her name, trying to get her to stop, but she just kept going. It did feel wrong to me even then as I followed her. If she'd truly been okay all this time, why hadn't she left and contacted her fiancé or family or friends? Why was she crawling around in the darkness behind the walls of this awful place, alone? But at the time, the only meaningful thought I could really focus on, overpowering in its insistence, was how I couldn't lose her again. While I was fumbling for my phone, I realized that Liz didn't have any source of light with her. She'd entered the tunnel the same way she'd left through it those years ago, in the pitch blackness. As I followed her, I realized what the smell had been in my room, that mixed with the bleach had been almost too faint to detect. But there in that tight space, just feet behind her, I recognized it. Earthiness. Death. I knew something was wrong, but we're so close to the exit and I was too focused on getting her out of there, walking out that door and never coming back. Not for my purse, my shoes, anything, because I had a very strong suspicion that if I did, we would never leave that hotel again. As we reached the end and stepped out of the cramped space and into the familiar back room, I nearly cried in relief. We were only 2 flights of stairs above the exit. We were actually going to make it out, both of us. But she didn't go down. She started to go up. "Liz!" I pleaded for her to come back, told her I knew where the exit was, but she continued on as if she hadn't heard me. I pulled at her in desperation. She shook me off with strength I didn't know she possessed. Realizing she wasn't going to stop, I reluctantly followed, thinking she must have known something I didn't, a better way out. It was the only thing that made sense. She'd slowed her pace to allow me to catch up. She was no longer fleeing. She was leading. I'd been occasionally pausing to shine my flashlight down below us, deep-seated fear growing as the exit became further and further away, and was eventually swallowed up by the darkness entirely. After what felt to my tired legs like a lifetime, she stopped and began to enter another crawl space, heading back deeper into the hotel. I froze. The already intense sense of wrongness overwhelmed me at the thought of going in. She turned back to smile at me briefly from the darkness, and I realized then that everything was going to be okay. I had found her. I knew that following her was the right thing to do. The new feeling of calm overrode my deeply seated fear of seeing what was on the other side of the tunnel. So I took a deep breath, and I found out what was on the 7th floor. I instantly felt much safer than I had anywhere else in that God-forsaken place as we stepped into the immaculate room that the tight tunnel opened into. This was a good place. Safe. I was suddenly very confident that we were going the right way. I followed her out of the room and down an immaculate hallway to a huge ballroom. Art Deco details, the chandelier. It was beautiful. That much was obvious, even in the dark. I felt an odd sense of excitement at the thought of approaching it, nearly giddy at the sight of the elegant golden elevator at the end. The exit. Finally. I froze for a moment when I heard a door slam shut somewhere behind me. But no matter how hard I tried to hold on to that concern, the intense feeling of alarm, I couldn't. It was quickly gone, beyond my reach. Everything was fine. She stepped into the elevator and smiled at me over her shoulder. I knew that was where I needed to be. I was ready to leave. I was only a few feet behind her when I tripped and fell to the side. I felt around to see what I had tripped over. It was a single shoe, the canvas stiff with long dried blood. When I looked up from it in confusion, I realized that the entire room had changed. The air carried a hint of old things, mildew and despair. The chandelier hung at an odd angle, ruined, rendered dark and useless by decades of neglect. Glass from shattered and now boarded-up windows littered the ground. The wooden floor was warped and stained, and the dated wallpaper had mostly peeled away. A sense of longing and ruin and sadness radiated through the huge room. I shivered as my beam illuminated what I had fallen into, a group of disintegrating suitcases. Torn clothes and other discarded belongings formed messy piles, encircling what had minutes ago appeared to be an elevator. With a new sense of horrified clarity, I realized what I'd almost stepped into, the open shaft, the one that had been walled up on every other floor. The doors were long gone, leaving only a few feet of damaged flooring between me and the 7-story drop below. Maybe if I had been paying more attention, I would have noticed the sounds sooner, the familiar earthy rot smell on the stale air coming from within it. But I was focused on something snagged on the metal opening. I told myself it couldn't have been Liz's. It couldn't be the Melvin's shirt she bought at the concert we went to years ago, the one she had worn to bed that night. It could have been anyone's, because Liz was fine. She was here with me. I heard the sound of something sharp on metal, the awful, ragged breaths she had been taking. I shined my flashlight up to see her slowly climbing up from the dark, gaping pit of the shaft. Her perfectly round eyes reflected back at me, like an animal's, like a predator. something that evolved in the darkness and could see far better in the lightless space than I could ever hope to. What I thought had been a smile, I realized then that it, simply had more teeth than it could comfortably fit in its mouth. The more I stared, frozen, the more I realized how wrong the face, all the details were. I couldn't understand how I didn't see it before, how I could have mistaken that thing for my best friend since childhood. For a brief, fleeting moment, I thought the not Liz was the most terrible thing I would ever see in my life, until I noticed more of them crawling up the shaft behind her, when I saw what they looked like when they weren't attempting to imitate a person. I was suddenly very aware of the door I had heard open and close behind me moments before. True fear, I've since learned, is seeing something you can barely comprehend, much less hope to outrun, standing between you and the only exit. I realized I was just holding my phone. I'd lost my pepper spray at some point. So I did the first thing I could think of. I shined my phone flashlight towards it, hoping that something so pale, that saw so well in the dark, that it wouldn't be able to handle the bright light. All I managed to do was get a clearer view of the two long limbs and those awful eyes as it continued towards me, unfazed. I fished my tiny knife out of my pocket and ran towards it. I didn't have any other plan. I just knew that I didn't want to die down there in the dark. With the haze I'd been trapped in earlier lifted, I became aware that the entire floor smelled like death. Unlike the room downstairs, no one had felt the need to try and mask it with a splash of bleach. Some doors had long fallen off their hinges and formed additional obstacles as they lay splintered. I tried dodging around the thing in the hall, but it managed to grab me, leaving a deep gash in my leg as it tried to pull me to the ground. I stabbed at it until it let go. All the blood, not sure whether it was its or mine, allowed me to slip through its grasp. At the end of the hall was the room we'd entered through, 747 crudely painted on the door. This time around, I realized it was filled with the remains of decaying furniture, along with other things I'd rather forget. I was actually relieved to shove myself back into the tight, lightless passageway, but not as much as I was when I stepped out of it. I was only 2 flights from the exit when I heard a chorus of wheezing breaths above me. I made the mistake of looking up, saw so many eyes trained on mine. There was another familiar face among them, wearing his usual predator's grin. I moved as fast as my tired, bleeding legs could carry me. Hearing them quickly close the distance between us was an excellent motivator. I was only a few feet ahead of them by the time I stumbled out the back exit, and I didn't stop running, unsure if they would follow me outside. Finally, I turned back to see nothing was there. I still didn't feel safe until I'd called Jared, and I was in the car with him and almost home. I refused to go to the hospital in that town. I didn't trust anyone. I was so afraid that they'd put me under, take me back to the hotel, and I'd wake up on the 7th floor again. Or maybe I wouldn't wake up at all. So, yes, I did make it home, but I wish I had a happier update to give. I still wonder who Liz must have seen in our room that night, who she would have followed so blindly. I try not to think about what must have happened afterwards. It's too painful. I haven't been able to sleep much since I've been home. All I see whenever I close my eyes are those things staring at me from down the dark hallway of the 7th floor. There's something else that's been keeping me awake, too. I had originally booked my reservation with a fake address, but in addition to everything else, I left my purse and ID behind when I fled my room. It's been a few weeks now, but I still can't help but wonder if soon I'll see those perfectly round eyes glinting at me from within the darkness of my own home, too.